Hello, everyone. Welcome to Collaborative Conversations on Building a Culture of Writing, a series designed to build teachers' capacity for writing instruction. Before we start the live conversation, we invite you to start and continue the conversation on Twitter. Use hashtag Culture of Writing and the handle at Godot ELA to start the conversation. Today is the fifth 612 session entitled Disciplinary Literacy. In this session, participants will examine appropriate strategies to help students read and think like experts in various content areas. We are excited to welcome back Dr. Megan Adams and Ms. Corey Tuttle as they share research and best practices for disciplinary literacy in grades 6 through 12. Before their session begins, we would like to begin by briefly reviewing the principles for universal design for learning. We encourage you to keep these principles in mind as you hear from today's presenters, and prepare to plan instruction to meet the needs of all students.
Good morning, everyone. Our colleague, Dee Bunn from Special Education Services and Supports was unable to join us this morning, so I will be sharing information about the Universal Design for Learning. The Universal Design for Learning, or UDL, is a framework that allows the teacher to build strategies and techniques into their lesson plans that not only reduce any possible barriers to instruction and learning, but it also provides a level of flexibility in ways that you engage your students, in the ways that you present information to students, and the ways that students can respond to show their understanding of the information provided. In order to provide that flexibility, UDL utilizes the framework of 3 principles. These principles are based in the neuroscience of how individuals learn and are the basis of UDL. These principles allow teachers to develop multiple means of engagement, creating purposeful, motivated learners, multiple means of representing the information that students need to learn, providing different ways for students to perceive, process, and comprehend the material presented. And lastly, multiple ways for students to act on the information that they are learning in ways that they can express their knowledge. So as you listen to today's webinar, we ask that you keep these principles in mind and how you may be able to use them to develop a lesson framework that will help you meet the needs of all students. For additional information on UDL and assistive technology, you can use the link that's displayed here. And we also encourage you to review the UDL guidelines that are in guidelines chart in our professional learning guide, and that can be accessed on the GSO website as well. On this chart, it identifies not only the 3 principles, but it also gives you guidelines and some checkpoints that can be used to help implement the principles. So again, as you listen to today's webinar, we just ask that you keep those principles in mind as you plan and think about effective instruction for all learners. So thank you, and I'll now turn it over to our dynamic presenters.
I'm Megan Adams. I'm from Kennesaw State University, and I'm an assistant professor of reading education.
Corey Tuttle. I'm an English teacher at Osborne High School in Cobb County.
So we're so excited to be back with you guys. We were here in January, and we found that feedback from the participants via Twitter and the chat feature was critical in helping us frame the conversation and make sure that it was an engaging session. So we'd really like to start by encouraging you to participate today if you're able. Today we're talking about disciplinary literacy and content area literacy. And we're going to talk about some differences between those two in just a little bit because they're not, though they're similar, they're not synonymous. We do want you to be aware that we realize that our participants today already know an integral piece of our presentation. And that is that we cannot develop strong writers without them being strong readers and vice versa. We also know that perhaps our non-ELA teachers understand that connection better than those of us who are ELA in some ways. And I say that to say that often if you're teaching in a content area and children struggle to take your test because they're unable to read the questions, we hear from those content area teachers all the time, you're not doing your job, language arts teacher. The kids can't do well on my test, despite the fact that they're able to do some of the functions of my content because they're unable to read in that content area well. So we realize that that's an area that we need to help develop. The other thing is that I understood when putting this together that as a language arts teacher, I often failed to put different genres into my own ELA teaching. In other words, if you are a science teacher and you know that when kids are conducting a chemistry experiment, they need to think differently than when they're working on a biology experiment, that's something that might come naturally to you in your content area. At least for me as a high school language arts teacher, it didn't always come naturally to differentiate between how students need to read as a journalist versus a novelist, for example. I also thought about some of you, last time we had an art teacher, or I think several art teachers who participated, and I thought about how an art teacher would teach Monet's style before asking students to paint in the imitation style of Monet. And so it's something that maybe we could keep in mind in other content areas as well. So for today, those are some of the things we're going to explore. What we are going to do is a KWL, but with a twist. So what do you know? Why should you care? And what did you learn? So if you'll keep that in mind as we go through the presentation, I think it'll all come together for you. And please do let us know if it's not before the end of the presentation.
Okay, so what we'd like for you guys to do is to either tweet with the hashtag Culture of Writing and at GADOE-ELA. How do you say that? Is the mix?
Godot.
Godot. I was like, or use the chat feature on the webinar. It's at the bottom. A couple of you guys have already chatted out questions. So what do you know about content area or disciplinary literacy is what we'd like you to start with. Please. And last time it really helped a lot when you guys were commenting and tweeting and doing that kind of stuff for us to kind of know where you were with all this stuff, because it is harder in a
We can't see
webinar
you.
kind of context as opposed to in a classroom setting.
One other note, we realize that some of you are in groups, and so there's a facilitator, and you may not have your phones out tweeting, or if you are, hopefully you're only tweeting about the Godot ELA work. But so if you guys want to have one person respond via the chat, that's really helpful as well.
Are you guys able to do it? I don't see anything yet. And it's weird when I'm looking over here because I'm looking at the screen where you guys are supposed to be hopefully chatting or tweeting. I do know some of y'all are on break. This is my winter break, so I get it. Maybe you haven't had enough coffee. So what do you know about content area or disciplinary literacy is the question.
I'll try one more. I'll ask it in a different way and see if that gets you thinking of anything. What do kids need to be able to read in your content area? And that's, if you're language arts, what do we need them to be able to read as well? 612. Should we check the sound just to be sure? We just want to make sure, it's okay if you are not ready to engage, but could you just raise your hand if you're still able to hear us? We want to make sure that's not the problem. Okay, okay.
So at the bottom of where you guys just did the raise your hand thing is the little chat. You click on the plus sign, and then you can type your message where it says type message here. Or we could just move on. And hopefully you guys will participate a little more
next.
so that we can.
Maybe they'll see that. Okay. Okay, so concerns about using informational or nonfiction texts, and what do we know? So the first thing I want to say is I was a high school language arts teacher and taught primarily, well, I taught 9th, 10th, and 11th grade lit. I won't say that it was primarily. And many of my friends, in particular my social studies teachers, would talk about the fact that with everything that they had to cover just to cover their basic standards, they didn't have time to add reading for pleasure, is how they saw it. So adding a novel, for example, whether it was historical fiction or a biography, was going to be something that was going to take way too much time. However, we were able to do something that was interdisciplinary. So I could teach the novel and cover my standards that way and have the novel tie thematically to what was being covered in that history class. That is always, I think, more challenging when you're trying to connect the readings for math and science, and that's one of the things that we're going to talk to you about today. There's some examples of how that will really work for our math science folks so that you can work with language arts teachers and we can work with you and understand how we can help students connect those content areas in a more fluid way. I'm going to go off of our slide for just a moment because I think we did get a tweet, and I don't want you all to be discouraged and not keep responding. So
Do you want me to read it for you?
Please.
Okay. Whoops. Tamika says that content area literacy refers to skills that students need to read in any content area, and disciplinary literacy refers to skills that are specific to reading and or writing in math, for example.
Great. That's great. That's a really good way to summarize it. Okay, so I have an anecdote for you. I am an avid reader. I'm a professor of reading education. I think it's probably obvious to you. But I think I said in our last session that I became a professor of reading in part because I taught so many high school students who were performing below grade level in reading. And my English degree, my bachelor's was English, and then my master's was in English education. And I had no idea how to teach high school kids to improve their reading. And so one of the reasons I think I had this disconnect was that I love reading so much that to me, I don't remember what it was like to learn to read. I don't remember a time in my life when I didn't have a book in my hand. So this story, I think, helped me kind of think through what other readers go through. Though I love to read, and you could ask me about just about any YA novel that's out there, and I could talk to you about it, anything that's on the New York Times bestseller list. I always have at least 1 or 2 novels going. I couldn't tell you the last time I read an informational text. I think actually I could because I made myself, but it's really infrequent. And I think of informational texts as nonfiction. So I don't think about reading a newspaper, which I do frequently, as reading an informational text. I don't know how many of you might think of a distinction that way. Maybe for you it isn't this challenging. But for me, thinking of nonfiction as informational text and not something so narrow as a biography on a mathematician it was really important. So when The Devil in the White City came out, and if you haven't read it, it really is a fantastic book about the Chicago World's Fair. I read that book, and I also really loved biographies of Anne Boleyn and Queen Elizabeth. I'm a big Shakespeare fan, and that era really appeals to me. So I wouldn't go so far as to say that I hate all informational or nonfiction texts, but I struggle with them. And for me, reading like that feels like reading for school, which is something that I'm more likely to skim and highlight and pull the necessary information from, instead of reading and devouring it because I really love the book. So what I just told you is sort of what I think of as a dirty little secret that now is on the web and everybody will know. But because as an English teacher, I know what I needed my kids to do was read for different purposes. Furthermore, though, I don't know when I decided that just because it wasn't pleasurable for me, it wasn't for anyone else. So years after I first read it, my brother, who I would describe as a non-reader, though he reads on Twitter and his news things on social media we can't even have a conversation because he's reading so much. But the last time he went to the library and checked out a book, I couldn't tell you. But when my brother first read The Devil in the White City, he read it from start to finish, barely put it down, and couldn't stop talking about it for weeks. Loves the author, reads everything he writes. So what I discovered was that what is pleasurable reading for me is miserable for my brother, and vice versa. And so I used the example with him of, how did you feel about Romeo and Juliet? So I did sort of like a mini study asking him questions. He hated Romeo and Juliet. He didn't read it. He pretended he read it when he was in school, but he never finished it, where I read it twice during the time that we were studying it because I loved it so much. So what I'm saying to you today is to remember that when we think about reading for a purpose, Corey and I said just before the session, oh, I haven't read a bunch of these because it seems like a chore to us, but for many of our students, I think these are the books they really enjoy more than what we think of as things that we'd really pick up and read for pleasure. I also think that for many of us who are teaching kids who are performing below grade level the skills to read and write in grades 6 through 12, it may be difficult for us to keep in mind that reading for them is something they are not good at, and therefore the struggle is in part because they don't picture themselves as readers. And helping them find whatever text allows them to picture themselves that way is going to be a critical hurdle that we need to jump to help them turn into lifelong readers and learners. So I think that what that really points out to me goes back to what we talked about with PBL, but also just student choice, allowing kids to thematically connect texts, but giving options of whether it's nonfiction, historical fiction, maybe even it's a fiction novel that you've read and feel like it covers the time period well enough. Those are things that I think will really allow students to thrive in our classrooms as we think about content area and disciplinary literacy.
And I think just to kind of add on to that, like my first thought when you were talking about kids not being able to kind of see themselves is that it also really helps if we find texts that where kids can really see themselves in the literature,
right.
Whether it's Latino literature, African American literature, or anything, whatever it may be, and giving them kind of choice with that. Like right now we're reading Mexican White Boy, which by Matt Lavadilla-Pena. It's a great YA book, and kids really can see themselves in all kind of three of the kind of main demographics at my school, at least, with African American and Hispanic and white, and kind of all those mixes and the way race interplays. And the kids really get into it because he speaks a lot of Spanish in the books, and so I have to have my kids that speak Spanish translate it, and they love it because they never get to do that in English class. We're reading Shakespeare and we're having to translate that, but so I think that really helps as well. But kind of back to the kind of PBL and how to incorporate nonfiction with that, we do a lot of like just with Mexican White Boy, what we're doing right now, we find articles on News ELA that are at different lexile levels that hit kind of some of the different issues in the book. So the kids are reading nonfiction. There was one article we just read about, one of them was about how a lot of native kind of Spanish speakers are not speaking Spanish at home anymore. So whether they're first or second generation immigrants, that they're not speaking Spanish at home anymore, and that it was something that they were kind of finding here in the U.S. Recently, that there was kind of a downturn of that. And then there was another article about poor kids. It was just talking about poor kids, and it related to the book that we were reading. So kind of trying to incorporate within whatever we're doing, incorporating nonfiction, where the kids can have choice, and they have 4 articles they can pick from that we've printed at different lexile levels. My team does that, so that we can kind of focus with that. Also with the PBL, so we kind of lovingly force them to find articles that relate to whatever their topic is. So, some kids, the example I gave last time was one of the groups made a garden. So, we had them find examples of other kids or people who have done kind of a PBL in that way. So kind of they have to research what's the problem and what has been done about it already. So they go research and find articles about other either groups or other students or other organizations that are kind of doing that same type of thing. And then also another one was the homeless, feeding the homeless, or a group of kids not feeding the homeless. They created like a care package sort of thing for homeless people on the streets and basically would walk up and give it to them. So we had them research some of the like reasons for homelessness and some of the, and they had to find articles about that that connected. And so that's a really easy way to incorporate across the curriculum in different subject areas, and also you're incorporating nonfiction in that. There also are, we're going to share in a little bit, some books that kind of talk about PBL and how some people have kind of gone out there and changed the world, like Tom's, the guy who created Tom's, the shoes. So that's another way, just kind of reading excerpts from different things and watching. There are lots of different video clips on YouTube, kind of trying to hit all the different kind of areas where we're not just reading, but we're also watching and listening and speaking and hitting kind of all the language arts standards, at least, with that. So we both kind of given you kind of an anecdote, kind of a little story about what we do and have done in our classes, or kind of us personally. So what are some of yours, your stories? So what would you need to incorporate informational texts in your class if you don't do so already? And if you do, how do you use them? So if you could use that fabulous chat feature that Tamika and Venus and I can't see the other name, Anna, have used already, if you guys could just share that with us. So the questions, once again, what are some of your stories? How do you, what do you need to incorporate more informational texts in your class? And if you do use them, how do you use them already? And that's really helpful just for us to learn from each other, because that's kind of the point of this. So if you could either tweet or chat feature it, that would be fantabulous.
So while you guys are typing those in, one thing that just occurred to me as Corey was talking is I told you about my friend who was the U.S. history teacher, and one of the things I'm thinking is that I don't know that he ever marked some of his standards as met. In other words, when his curriculum map was laid out, I don't know if he ever marked standards as met that were being covered in my class as we worked on those texts. And that might be something we could think about too, or that you guys could, in the follow-up beyond the session, think about is, I know that we're all, most of the teachers I know are like me, and we want to make sure that we are the A+ teacher, and so we want to check those boxes ourselves. We kind of have the control thing, but if we plan as a team and do that interdisciplinary work, like Corey was saying, they pull the articles together, it'd be really cool if we could get to a point where some of our standards are covered in a class that therefore we have more time for in-depth discussions about something else. We do have a tweet or a chat.
So from Dawn, it says, she says, I think it's important to incorporate cross-content connections, especially with social studies, primary source documents. Definitely.
Absolutely. Thank you for that.
It's probably the easiest one in language arts too. English is social studies to connect.
Absolutely.
Venus says, with Anne Frank unit, use News ELA articles of various injustices so students could choose a topic they were passionate about. I was able to find 4 articles on each topic and was able to choose varying levels or varying lexiles to meet the ability level needs.
I love that one. That's great.
I think injustice is such, we've done a lot with that in my 9th grade lit class, just because there's so much different stuff going on right now.
And kids see it so frequently.
Also, Tamika says, using informational text to introduce narrative, for example, using an article about lack of clean water in many third world countries prior to reading A Long Walk to Water by Linda Sue Park.
I love that. And the current connections, I'm always thinking about how to do the news articles. There's so much about Flint and what they're going through with their water that there are really cool connections for those content areas as well. Thank you for that. Okay, thank you guys so much, and we'll come back if there are more between. Okay, so why should we care about this? It is very easy, I think, and not easy. Teaching's hard no matter what content we're in, but it becomes a habit to be locked into my ELA standards. I'm teaching 11th grade American literature. These are my standards. This is what I'm going to cover. I've got my curriculum map. I've got my novels picked out. I know where I'm doing the informational. I'm done. And so it's very easy to get into that habit and not look into what do my kids need that I can help provide as the ELA content person that will help them in U.S. history, or as a U.S. history person, what can that teacher provide that will help them master content in American Lit, for example. The same thing is true in science and math. So content area literacy has been focused upon for a long time. We've known, and elementary school teachers in particular know the importance and how critical this is, that they have to be able to read in different content areas. And this happened long before Common Core. However, though those require different reading skills, that's very different from disciplinary literacy. So, and Tamika said this earlier, and I absolutely agree. Content area literacy simply means being able to read in those content areas. Disciplinary literacy emphasizes that there's an important difference between content area literacy and disciplinary literacy. Though a content area is a discipline, a content area is a little broader. So for example, science is the content area teacher, instead of focusing on biology or physics, chemistry, and the difference in how you need to read in those different disciplines. The other thing is that instead of teaching kids to read various things in content areas, which Shanahan says is a passive task, we need to ask them to read and think like experts in those content areas. So last time we had a conversation in here, an idea that I loved was to have students literally put on different hats. So today I'm wearing the hat of an engineer and I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. And I think that that's a way that we can wrap our heads around the difference. Just to show you though, and this will be included of course when the webinar is shared, there are some great tools on disciplinary literacy, and y'all, I'm not the most tech savvy person, so forgive me if it doesn't come right back after I'm done. So this is the Cedar Center, and it's a shame Dee Dee's not here today because she would be so excited. The Cedar Center focuses on integrating the needs for reading and students with disabilities across all content areas. And one of the things that they do is come up with these modules that can be used in college level classes or professional development trainings for teachers. The thing I like about it is that it gives you examples of the literacy strategies in the 4 major disciplines, but then it also has, excuse me for scrolling if I'm making you dizzy, it has objectives for doing that. And just one more part of the page I want to show you is they have these references and resources. Which obviously are helpful if you're trying to follow up. And my favorite part is the multimedia. I'm not going to have you watch one of these today, but just so you know, any question you might have about disciplinary literacy, they do a really thorough job with these modules where they're short videos and you can watch. So for example, how is disciplinary literacy different from content area literacy? What you would watch is a short video where Dr. Shanahan is explaining the difference between the two. So these are really helpful, I think, as you try to sort through what you want to do with disciplinary literacy in your own content area. I think I did it. We'll see if I did it. Okay. I don't think you probably do because you've been engaging with us, but does anybody, we want to stop and ask if you have any questions so far. If there's anything, it can be any question. Something about the presentation, the sound, anything about the content we've covered so far, questions about The differences between content area and disciplinary literacy. I'll give you just a minute. Anything? Okay, great. Okay, so we talked in our January session about how obvious some of the writing demands are for ELA teachers. And so I said in my anecdote that sometimes I think for reading in the disciplines, the ELA teachers are maybe the ones who are just a bit behind. And one of the things I've thought about, written about, and studied, part of the reason I went back for my PhD in the first place is the number of English teachers I worked with who said, it's not my job to teach kids how to read. And when we move into 6 through 12, I understand that because that is absolutely not our training as an English teacher. Our training is on the language aspect as opposed to the reading aspect. But I also disagree with that old adage that all teachers are teachers of reading. Though we don't naturally intuit how to teach kids how to read. But one thing I do think is in our content areas as experts, and so for example, if you were an English major or you were a chemistry major, or even if you were middle grade science education, you do have an expertise in what it takes to master your own discipline. And to think about what you need to read and how you need to read in order to do that, I think is where we can all get on the same page and really move kids forward in some dramatic ways in their mastery of reading skills in grades 6 through 12 across all of our disciplines. Do you want to go ahead with some of your?
Yeah, so just kind of along with that, first, kind of the first thing I was thinking of with the putting on kind of your different hats, and this is an English example, but you could use it in different subject areas. At Osborne right now, like 3 times this semester, we're doing they call it Cardinal Con, which were the Cardinals, but it's like the Friday before break, so we just had one last Friday. And basically, teachers kind of give students choice. If they're doing well in class, they get an enrichment kind of class, and if they're struggle, they have some anchoring sessions where it may be persuasive writing or argumentative, or that's the same thing, but informative, whatever the different kind of writing or reading kind of focuses. And then if they need makeup or they need remediation, then we have those sessions. So basically all the English department, it's a little bit of chaos, but it's great because these kids get all these different kind of opportunities for remediation and extension and kind of anchoring stuff. But I just did a session on hip hop through different critical lenses. So kids they basically picked a table and sat, and they had to look at the song that I had picked, and then they had to look at it through a different critical lens. So I had one table that was critical race, so they had to look at that song and find their own example that was just basically focused on how are race relations kind of in that song. And then they had to look at another, it was had a social justice one and a feminist, and I made up kind of a consumerist because a lot of hip hop's all about getting money and stuff like that. But they had to look at the songs through these different lenses, and the songs that I picked were very obvious. Some of them, like for the consumerism, there was a Wu-Tang song called Cream, which is all about cash rolls, everything around me is the title of the song, so it was kind of obvious, but then they had to find their own song. So that's kind of one way in English where we've had kids look at literature, because songs are poetry, through different lenses. So that kind of has a similar kind of task in at least an English class where they're looking at different things, not quite as a scientist or other things, but that was just something that kind of came to mind. Also at our school we have a community reads program. So I'm not quite sure exactly how it works, whether it's a grant or what, but we have these books that are nonfiction texts that are kind of read across the school by students, and it's invited kind of for the community to come out. So these are some of the books that I found that they've done in the past few years, so I was just going to share because they're all nonfiction texts, and they're kind of easy ways to kind of incorporate different texts in your class. This one's one called Friend Influence. It's all about basically the role of friends in our culture, social media, and things like that. This one is Finding Mañana. It's all about the Cuban exodus. It's a memoir all about that. This one's No Turning Back. It's he's a triple amputee, I think, and sorry, and it's really interesting. He was in Iraq, and it's all about his kind of story. With that, this one's great. It's called How Does It Feel to Be a Problem? And it has like seven different short stories about Arab Americans being young and Arab in America. So it's really interesting for a different kind of perspective on things. This one's, I have not read, but this one is all about, sorry, I'm not very good at holding it up to the camera. This one's all about living kind of a no-impact life, so trying to save the planet through living in a non-impact way. This one actually connects to one of the books that Megan brought, same author, Neil Bascom. It's all about the first robotics competition in high schools, and kind of that whole story. And then one I actually started reading, it's kind of dirty, I'm sorry, the cover's kind of gross, but it's about the guy who started Tom's. So Start Something That Matters. It's his story, basically of how he, and this one's great for PBL. I'm actually, our units, it's the third unit, I'm actually going to have him read parts of this, because it basically details how he came up with the idea for the company and how he wanted to make a difference. So with every pair of shoes that they sell, they give a pair away, and that was his big thing. So this book's actually really, really interesting for that. So those were just some that I found in our media center that were just some ideas that I had for how we could kind of connect that in our classes. And you know, those are obviously a little more high school level books, but for the most part, you can find other books and other resources that connect with all of that.
We have some more books to share with you in just a little bit. Those are just some of our initial ideas, but we're going to do another chat or tweet. I used ELA examples because as I've been confessing to you, I didn't do a great job of having my students try on the different hats. How often did I ask them to read like a journalist, a librarian, a screenwriter, a musician, a novelist? So in your content area, it might be how often do you ask students to read like an art historian, an artist, a filmmaker? How often do you in science ask your students to think like a chemist as opposed to a biologist? In math, it might be an engineer. So if you would, take just a moment and either use the chat feature for the webinar or tweet and let us know if you do that, and if so, maybe how you do it or how often you do. And we'll give you just a couple of minutes to think about that and to type. Y'all are probably faster than I am at the typing anyway, though. Nothing yet. I know you guys have great ideas. We're going to give you just another second. We didn't ask, and maybe we could start with this, if you could tell us what your content areas are, because maybe we're all language arts today, and then you're sitting there thinking, my situation is the same as theirs. Okay. I don't want to be the impatient teacher, but we'll move to the next slide, and hopefully you guys will respond between. Okay, so when thinking about the challenge of if you are like me and you are going to be sort of hesitantly or reluctantly incorporating these nonfiction informational texts, and it's not your thing, then that might also mean that you know how to do it in the way that I did as a college student or even as a graduate student, that you approach a nonfiction text with your highlighter and notes in the margins, and you're going to have the little tabs on the pages. And I don't know that our kids all love to approach it that way. So this is a read, write, think lesson that I like very much. It's called Thieves. And it is something that you can use to preview nonfiction texts. And I'm sure that most of you are familiar with this, but just in case, Read, Write, Think organizes their lesson examples in this way. So there's a preview, and then there's a connection to the standards. You can select your state, and it'll pull up the matching state standards, and then it also has what are currently still the NCTE/IRA standards for English language arts. Those IRA standards are in the process of becoming ILA because they've switched to the Literacy Association, but it's still relevant for you. It also gives you what you need for your resources and preparation. So it gives you the materials and technology. So one thing, just as a side note, I love is if you're going to need, for example, to get your laptop cart or go to the computer lab that day, it'll tell you in advance. It has the printouts that you would need, online articles, and sample chapters. And then below that, it tells you what you would need to do to prepare. I think all of us appreciate that. It's also tied to an instructional plan. And so it gives you the objectives for students and then a model lesson. And what's really cool, I think, this is focused on 6 through 8, but this is absolutely applicable for high school students. And so for my high school students, a lot of it was, they'd start with, that's for babies. Why do we have to do that? But then once they got into it, they would really appreciate what it was making them do and how helpful it was. So basically, they're going to become, quote, thieves, and they're going to steal information. And they have display the transparency. I have no idea if y'all still use transparencies, but just in case you don't, you can use it as a handout, obviously. And so it's just a graphic organizer for you to use. So students are supposed to find initially the title. They're going to look for headings. They're going to look for information that's in the chapter, and it will guide you through how to give that lesson. So each element is supposed to be identified, and it tells you that there's an acronym above, excuse me. They want the students to figure that out because one of the things it wants them to do is to be able to chunk information. I wanted to share this one with you for a couple of reasons. One is I like it because it's a graphic organizer that helps students make sense of a text that can be a little daunting, especially if they're not used to using their textbook this way, because the textbooks are typically divided the same way in a chapter where there's a title, the heading, the information, the elements of those sections, etc. But also because I think this is a really important tool to use when you have them think about the way they need to read on tests. And I don't mean just the milestones or graduation tests or end of course tests or any other tests that we end up working with. I also mean things like the SAT, the ACT, later if they go to take the GRE. Understanding how to find the information that they need quickly in a section of a text is a really difficult skill to master. And it's advanced reading. So if you have kids who are in an 8th grade class who are performing at a 4th grade reading level, this is certainly not something that they will have mastered yet, and this graphic organizer really helps them with that. So that's what we like. How to apply to 912 would depend on your context. So for me, I always did it in a joking manner, and I would say, oh, you guys did this in middle school? I just didn't understand. So if you don't need this, let's just go ahead and do it the old-fashioned way, and you guys just tell me how you need to find the information. And then, you know, they'd hesitate and joke back, and then we'd end up doing it because they'd be basically admitting that though it's for babies, they don't know how to do it. In another way to apply it to 912, of course, would be to come up with your own acronym and not use the handouts if you feel like they are too elementary, and come up with something like, even for our doctoral students, and maybe I should have shared this with Corey before she finished her dissertation this week, but we need them to understand that every heading is supposed to have subheadings, and that those are there to help the reader, not just to help them organize their information. So the APA definition of what those headings and subheadings are for is something that you could easily adapt to your classroom if your students are more advanced and are ready to move on, so that they understand when you're reading something and it has a heading, what you should initially see is more of a brief introduction, and then when you go into the subheading, anything in that subheading should be the meat of what you're arguing about, whatever that topic is. In the lesson plan, this is a note that I thought would be important for you guys. It says that Thieves is for textbooks primarily, and I think that's in part because this is a 6 through 8 lesson. That's the way it was designed by the teacher who shared it on Read, Write, Think. But I think it's particularly helpful with nonfiction and informational texts. And like I said, I think it's also really good for test preparation purposes. So this is the fun part. We get to do sort of a show and tell with you guys. So we'll start with these, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about grades 11 and 12 and what I think of as a little bit of a difference there. So to start with, some of the texts that we love and have either read or read great reviews of or heard reviews from friends are what we listed here. But before that, I want to tell you what I did, because I think that might be the most critical part of our webinar today. I went in and started with NCTE and the ALA, American Library Association, and I looked at the most recommended and checked out books in nonfiction. And then I went back, once I had the list of books that looked very interesting and that I thought would be applicable and appropriate for different grade levels, and I looked at the standards. And so for the purpose of this webinar, I wanted to go across. So I wanted to make sure that we covered grades 6 through 12, but also that we covered social studies, science, and mathematics, all three. And so it was relatively easy to go in. And I started, obviously, with the Georgia DOE website, and I went into the state standards, and I clicked on 6 through 8 first, and then went to grade 6 social studies. So the first book, this is the one that's by the same author that Corey had a book from. Hold on, I'm going to master this. Neil Boscombe is the author. And the one that's listed is the Nazi Hunters. This is the other one. The Nazi Hunters was checked out at my library, but there are 3 that he's written. And what we've decided after seeing his other book today is he's really smart. His focus, he got ahead of the game and did nonfiction for middle and high school students. So there was an easy tie to the European history portion of the 6th grade social studies standards. And he had several books that worked that way. For grade 7, I don't have a sample to show you of this book. Actually, my library did not carry it, but the title is Sugar Changed the World. The authors are Mark Aronson and Marina Budos. There's a powerful connection to India, heritage, and slavery, and what sugar drove as far as those different social movements and cultural phenomena. And that really covers a lot of the ELA and social studies standards. So not just, so in 6th grade, admittedly, the European history standards are just a small chunk of what has to be covered over the whole school year. So this would be one of those texts that would be an ELA text that would be hit upon in the social studies classroom, but might not be a focus. This book in grade 7 could honestly be co-taught where they're reading it for their social studies class and for their language arts class. The other thing that I think is really cool about this book is for your, just for you to know, the authors are husband and wife, and both of them write juvenile nonfiction and young adult nonfiction. And so when researching this book and how it might be used, there are a lot of other books that come up under those authors' names that you could use in your classroom, which I thought was really great. This one comes, it's the most highly recommended of any that we brought with us today. And the title is The Man Who Loved Only Numbers. And the author is Paul Hoffman. It's about Paul Erdos. This is a book about a mathematician, and I wanted to show you, I wanted to show you that this mathematician also has a number of children's books. And I think using these as a companion text, whether you're in a middle or high school classroom, is a really helpful way for your kids performing below grade level in reading to still get information easily so that they know a fair amount and that's their prior knowledge before going into a more challenging text like this. And of course, to me at least, it's a little challenging to find novels that work well in math, and so this was very exciting. We also brought, for grade 9, the Poisoner's Handbook, which I think it made me really want to be in the classroom, you guys, because this one is all about forensic science, and they get to do CSI type projects that go along with it. So there's a nice connection to chemistry, but there's also just that cool kids really get into it because there's a lot of mystery. And so the reviews of this one are all about, I'm only about halfway through it, but let me read you this one review. She's cooked up a delicious addictive brew, murder, forensic toxicology, New York City in the 20s, the biochemistry of poison. So it's going to be a page turner, and kids are really going to love it, especially those who are interested in that, in the CSI science type stuff. And this one, Corey has used in her classroom, so I'm going to let her talk about it. Some of you may have seen this. It's been a huge hit, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, and this has the biology connection, so it could be taught in biology or in language arts, but certainly the connection's there to cover a lot of those standards.
And it also connects a lot with injustice and all of that because I don't know if you know the story of Henrietta Lacks. It is a very technical book in part, so it depends on your students. My 9th graders, we did not read the whole thing. We read parts of it and talked mostly about injustice and with all of that because basically her cells, she had cancer. She was an African-American woman and a poor woman in the 50s, and her cells kind of became the way that they work with cancer nowadays, and they were sold for millions and billions because they've been reproduced over and over. Anyways, and her family, did not get funds from that, and they basically stole the cells from her. So it's a very interesting book, though. Kids really connect to it, and there's a lot. I learned a whole lot. I was like, holy cow, I did not know any of that. So with that, but it does connect definitely across biology and across other things with all of that.
So I did not list grade 11 or grade 12, and that was intentional. And so one of the things that I kept finding was students who had come back from college, whether they came back after they graduated or after their first 2 years, and this was universally true whether they had gone to a technical school. Many of my students went to historically black colleges and universities. Many of them went to smaller community-type colleges, but that still granted 4-year degrees. And the complaint was universal that when they got into English 1101 and 1102, they felt ill-prepared. Their writing was not where it needed to be, and they did not know how to read for the purpose of writing what they needed. In other words, they knew how to sit down and read a short story in the textbook or even a novel that had been assigned, but they did not know how to take what they needed and integrate sources and do what we would think of as a more traditional research paper. And many of those same students had taken AP Language in 11th grade or AP Lit in 12th grade. Now, granted, our school's policy as a rural school was that we wanted kids to be exposed to those courses, so they didn't test in. So students could have not been the best student in language arts and still been allowed to take those AP courses. And I'm saying that just to say that though they took the courses, it doesn't necessarily mean that they had been an honors track student from 6 through 12. So that could have been part of the reason that they had this disconnect. But what I realized was when we did planning and we looked at 9 through 12, and this seems to be true with the schools that I'm working with now, high schools in particular, In grades 11 and 12, if they're non-honors, they're in American Lit in 11th grade and British Lit in 12th grade for the most part. And we're still very much teaching those courses the way that we taught language arts in grades 9 and 10. So, of course, they're doing some research, and there's a unit, I think it's every other unit now is the template for the ELA for high school. Every other is informational. However, I'm saying that to say that while you can certainly do something similar to what we've suggested here, if you don't use PBL or research as the primary method of reading and writing for students in grades 11 and 12 yet, if I were going back in tomorrow to the classroom, that's certainly a change that I would make right away for my students, because I think that's the best way to get them really prepared for what they're going to need when they go on either to the workforce or to post-secondary school. So we know that we should emphasize those in every grade level, and we've really pushed the increase in writing and the increase in academic writing, where they're using sources and integrating a lot of different information to back up their argument. But I'm not sure that we've fully gone to that's the primary way that we're setting up units in grades 11 and 12. And what that would mean, I think, is more like what Corey has described that they're doing at Osborne in grade 9, which is that you would have texts that were available for students, but there wouldn't necessarily be one anchor text that all of the kids were reading, because they would really be doing research to drive whatever it was that they were looking into. Again, we'll stop just for a few minutes and see if you have any questions, comments, or concerns.
Feel free to use that chat feature at the bottom. You're more than welcome. Or tweet.
I love that picture. We're watching for your tweets, and the picture of the two of us keeps coming up.
That picture I don't love so much. I'm like, ugh.
Okay. Okay, working across disciplines. So something that I think is important for us to remember is that your text can complement what's going on in those other subject areas, even if collaboration isn't possible. So if I wanted to use my awesome Poisoner's Handbook text in 9th grade Lit, I don't necessarily have to partner with a biology teacher to do so. And what I think would be really neat is to see how kids might take it upon themselves if the collaboration wasn't possible. What I hear back later from the biology teacher, oh, we read that in Miss Adams' class. Or I know about how that works because we were talking about that when we read the Poisoner's Handbook. I would, oh, sorry.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I think, too, you can even ask those teachers, hey, is there any area you'd like us to hit? We need to read some more nonfiction. You know, what are you doing right now in environmental science is the big 9th grade science at my school, or biology, or even in math. Like, is there anything that your students are struggling with reading-wise, if it's word problems, that I can help them with? I mean, you can ask. They may not want to collaborate with you, but they can at least, you know, hopefully give you some ideas. Mm-hmm. And, you know, it's no skin off their back. They don't have to do anything other than just kind of tell you what they're doing. It'd be great if they wanted to collaborate, but like at my school, that's really hard because we're on block and, you know, all my students don't have math at the same time or social studies or whatever. But you could still get those ideas, and it doesn't hurt any of your kids to read more, especially when you are trying to connect it for, you know, half of your students that do have biology or environmental science. So that's kind of an easy way to collaborate without, you know, them being stressed out about it.
The other thing is to remember that when you're looking for nonfiction and informational text to use in an ELA classroom, do start with the standards of your grade level content partners. Their standards will provide some themes so that if you're choosing between two texts that you've really wanted to teach and one has a theme that's really going to tie to what they're doing in science, you might choose the text that has the better tie to their other courses. One of the things we know about students who struggle in school and students who drop out of school is that they don't see the relevance, and that when we get feedback from them, a lot of the time they say that that's because they don't see a connection between what they're learning. So the old, when will I ever use this again, where if they see that this is something that connects across their content areas, they can kind of get a better picture of how that could turn into a career one day, that kind of linking, like we talked about with the CSI and forensics.
And that's also one of the things I love about PBL too, is because they really are, they're picking topics, or you can do it however you'd like, but you can have them pick topics that they actually care about. Right. So, you know, they may be researching the difference, let's say in Cobb County, of like green space for South Cobb versus like East Cobb. In a high poverty area versus a wealthier area. What's the difference in green space, or sidewalks, or availability of fresh foods, things like that that they can research that actually affect them, or like how to get a new park in their area, or how to get whatever it may be. It's stuff they may care about, they may not care about it, but it's giving them all those real world kind of skills that they need to be able to research and to be able to communicate that clearly what they found, and come up with a solution, or try to come up with a solution. They may not fix it, but they can, you know, they can help things, and they're reading and writing and listening and speaking and doing all those, and they are engaged, and it's real world stuff, and it is stuff that applies to their lives. So a lot of times they are more engaged with that. So not that you have to use PBL, but it's a
helpful tool.
Easy. Sort
of. The other thing is I love librarians. If I didn't like to talk so much, I probably would have been a librarian. So I feel like they always know more about the newest books that have come out than we do, and an example of that is this ALA nonfiction winners list. Another thing before I click there is to tell you that NCTE, while it is the National Organization for Teachers of English, just like we need to start pillaging content area standards of other contents outside of English, I hope that content area teachers will start using English standards as well. NCTE has a great Twitter feed, and they've been recently, I don't know if it was just serendipitous or what, but they've been posting a lot about nonfiction and informational texts, and their tweets were helpful in finding some resources for this presentation and for my teaching. So the ALA nonfiction winners list is taking just a second to load. Sorry about that. It's a great place for you guys to start because it goes back several years and has a list of texts that you can use. Do you want me to shrink it down because it's pulled up already?
There we go.
I was too impatient, as usual. So you can see here that in 2014, the winner was the Nazi hunters that we listed on our slide, but also pay attention to those finalists. And this is for young adults. You can also go into the juvenile nonfiction section, and my daughter is reading at about a 3rd grade reading level, and so I was in the child section of the library looking there, and there are some great books that could be used, especially in a middle school classroom where you could have several different options but that all had the same theme. And that's true for each year. 2015's winner is also on this page. I thought that you might like to see there are other things you can click on here. There are resources, and obviously it's broken down by library staff and teachers, but then also for parents and teens. And so those are tools that you can use. And then this next one is my absolute favorite, and it's going to take just a couple of minutes to show you what's available here. Now, I'm going to preface this by saying that this is not in any way, shape, or form a sales pitch. I have never myself purchased a membership to this website because it's very expensive, and I wasn't in a school where we could afford it. But you can do so if your school has the money available to sign up, and I think it would be absolutely fantastic. These sample units have been the same sample units at least since 2007 because that's when I first used one. So the standards need to be updated if you're going to use this and apply it to your standards. But the other thing I want to tell you is I was working with a group of teachers getting their reading endorsement in Fulton County, and one of the math teachers took one of these units and started using it the next day after she saw this. So it's very cool. Let's see if I can get it to go. Okay, so another sort of caveat is don't be put off by the fact that this says that it's for gifted children, though it is, and it's fantastic for that population, and that's why I first researched it, because it was not an area of expertise I had, I would also say that it's very close to PBL, and it's just awesome for any kids. So these are the sample units. I don't want to click anywhere. There we go. Okay, and what you'll see is that they're divided up between primary units, intermediate units, middle school units, and high school units. And just because I feel like I'm typically biased towards high school, I'm going to click on one of the middle school units. So this one is called First Flight of the Coordinate Plane, or it's all downhill from here. They're also kind of funny. So of course that's appealing. But what I want to show you about these units is that they're interdisciplinary. And they start with an overview, which includes the content, process, and product. And then they align to national, state, district, and pupil performance standards. So this is aligned to California state standards, but of course, many of us do this with other lessons. It's very easy to adapt those to the Georgia standards. But my favorite part of the whole thing are these iSearch independent research projects. Again, ignore the for gifted and talented students, because this is good for all kids. And so what you do is, based upon the theme of this unit, you have, typically there's something like 22 to 25 different options that you can present. This is just a personal preference, I think, but for my kids, that was too many options. So I would look and kind of divide them into categories and give them more like 12 options to choose from. It would be up to you how you chose to do that. But so let me just read a couple of these. I'm sure that you guys can see them just as well as I can, maybe better than I can. So for provocative questions, number 5, slope is identified in the slope-intercept form as the letter M, which can be easily remembered by relationship of slope M to mountain. Devise a mnemonic device to remember what the y-intercept B represents. So they're going to come up with a mnemonic device to help them remember that, just like you can for the slope. But then they also have, and that would be great for kids who remember things that way, they also have, so study creative people and process. Role play or create a skit showing Newton's laws that involve slope. So I love that it allows kids, it really goes back to how we used to talk about, we wanted to make sure we covered audio, visual, tactile, and kinesthetic. This is an extension of that, where they're going through each of the different ways that kids might learn, and each one of them addresses several different points on blooms. This is the tie to economics, number 1. Then it has the higher order thinking skills there. Again, there's a tie to the state standards. There's a tie to transportation, and this is true across each of these units, which is, I think, very interesting, because what they're talking about is how does it tie to things outside of your content area. And transportation typically ties in with something that they're doing in math or science. There's the tie to communications, and again, notice that in each one there's a list of what the higher order thinking skills are. And under each of those, there are different activities and assignments that the students can use. I just also want to point out to you, I'm on page 8 of 25. These units are huge. I just want to go to one more and show you. This, to me, is a little bit like what Corey has been describing, that with any of these texts, you can also tie into the students, and especially middle and high school students tend to have that really developed sense of injustice, what's wrong in their world, even if they don't really understand what that might mean for others. And so here they have this moral, ethical, and spiritual behavior. And there's an anticipatory set where they talk about the golden rule. And they connect to where that actually came from. And students then create this pictograph. And they use different religions so that there's not a push towards one over the other. And it has the comprehension and the application. And then below that, you can see multicultural, ESL, or bilingual link. And they're saying you don't need to add anything because this activity is already so highly multicultural that you don't need to add an additional component. So I wanted to point out just some of the features of these that I think are really helpful. again, these are the sample units that are free on the website. And like I said, it's been 10 years that I know of that they haven't changed. But I think they also give us some ideas where you can take that and adapt it and do something similar to the PBL. But if you want to do PBL but have it really focused on, let's say there's certain standards you really want to cover, I could imagine it in 11th grade American Lit in particular. So there's this certain time period in American literature that you want to cover. I could picture putting together something like this so that there is student choice, much like PBL, involved, and you're really developing their higher order thinking, their comprehension, how to link it to something at home. So you're still using some of the, what I think are the integral components of PBL for student engagement, but you're doing it with a more tightly tied theme to something that you want to cover in your standards. I'm going to stop there for just a second, because that website is a lot, and I didn't even go halfway yet. I think we have a place for questions. We don't. So I didn't stop to ask you questions after all that, and should have. I'm going to stop here, even though there's not a tweet link, and just for just a second to see if anybody has any questions about any of that. What's that? Can you?
No,
Oh, okay. 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 Hopefully that means you guys are okay. I hope you will go and explore that website, though, because it's so much fun. All of the websites are, but that one in particular is a lot of fun to think about lesson planning. So what did we learn? The L part of our KWL. So what I learned, or what we have learned through these webinars, is that we connected with each other. I'm on her doctoral committee, and yet we weren't following each other on Twitter. And so now there's an easy way to kind of keep up with what's going on. It was also a great way to keep up with other teachers. Ashley has posted a lot about the Godot work, and I think it's Ashley Morris, actually. And so we've been able to see a lot about what's going on in Cobb County and other places by staying in touch through Twitter, following those sessions. And also, I think it's a great way for us to see what's happening with the DOE ELA work through Twitter. So that's something that we've learned. It's a great way to support each other, and we hope you'll continue to follow us and use the hashtag culture of writing far beyond these webinars, because it's helpful for all of us. We also created the website drmeganadams.educatorpages.com. We can use that space if you're interested. After our last session, we did not get people uploading documents or sending anything to us. That doesn't mean that you won't. We just haven't had that yet. But that's another option available. Finally, there was an idea that came from a teacher who's also in our program at Kennesaw about district book swaps. So Corey was describing a program that they have at Osborne where they have access to these nonfiction informational texts. And what the teacher was asking was, within a district, could they be loaned across schools? So if the middle school has some great books, could there be a trade where for a certain amount of time I get to use books that Corey has and she gets to use books that I have? And how might you start something like that was the question that she posed. I would say it's a great idea, and I would imagine that it would be a question that the principals of each school could answer. If it's within the same district, I wouldn't imagine that it would pose as great an issue as if you were trying to do it across school districts, where I don't know how you would make sure you got all your books back and what happens if you don't, and all of that.
I think a lot of districts, I mean, I know Cobb does that already. Like, I can check out a set of books from a different
From
school
anywhere.
through the media center. I mean, so I'm sure other
Counties are
districts
probably
may
doing the same.
do that as well. So, but like some of these, like these books that are the community reads books, aren't even, they're not barcoded. They're like a separate grant. So things like that could be loaned as well.
Mhm.
You know, just talking to probably
Teacher
media center.
communication and talking to the
Yeah.
media center. Did you want to share anything in this part? Or are you good?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I mean, you know, share. I love to share stuff. I think all of us are great at borrowing each other's things and adapting them to fit in our own classroom. So we'll share back some more stuff. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact either of us. Detail stuff. If you want to know how we did something we talked about, just feel free to tweet us or email us. I don't know what contact information you have from us, but hey, it's all out there somewhere, I'm sure.
So we'll stop here for questions, and I know there's some follow-up at the end we want to make sure we give you time for. Are there any questions, comments, or concerns before Corey and I finish our part of the presentation? You guys were a little quieter today. I hope that's not a sign.
It's
Maybe
winter
you're just
break.
reading
it's
so
winter
much.
break for a lot of us, so I get it. It's okay.
Are there exploring websites? We can hope. Anything? Okay.
Okay, we would like to share with you some additional professional learning opportunities. We've partnered with several national writing project sites across the state. And so we wanted to share with you some of the PL opportunities that are offered at their individual sites. So as you see on the screen, the Red Clay Writing Project, they are currently offering Saturday morning workshops at the UGA Gwinnett County campus. And they have several coming up in February, March, and April. And then the Kennesaw Mountain Writing Project also offers Saturday workshops. And you can see there the next one for nonfiction writing is coming up on March 11th. So we invite you to explore their web pages to learn a little bit more about the course, the workshops offered, as well as how to go about registering. And then the Kennesaw Mountain Writing Project is also offering a summer institute. And as you see, the application deadline is quickly approaching. So if you're interested in attending, again, there is the link there for you to click and just apply and get additional information about the Summer Institute. And here, another PL opportunity is at Georgia Southern. And they're facilitating a Student Success in Writing Conference, and that'll be held in April in Savannah. And this particular conference aims at targets high school writing teachers, and they want to bring them together with higher ed faculty to really spend some time together dedicated to improving student success in writing. So if you're interested in attending any of those workshops, we invite you to click on the link, and there you'll find additional information on the things that we've shared today, as well as any future professional opportunities available, in addition to the dates, times, and costs associated with attending the workshops and seminars. So we hope that you would take advantage of those as well. Coming up next month, we just want to give a little teaser. We have a bonus webinar to accompany our digital literacy session next month. We have 2 representatives from Georgia Public Broadcasting and Discovery Education who will come and share with you the wonderful resources that are available to teachers for free. So they'll be here to, or they'll be a webinar available to you after our March 14th K-5 literacy session. And again, free resources, lots of lessons and live streaming videos. So we hope that you would join us next month. Just something else to look forward to.
We would like to thank you for joining us for the 5th session, Disciplinary Literacy. We also want to thank our presenters, Dr. Megan Adams and Ms. Corey Tuttle. As you prepare to leave us, remember that the follow-up professional learning has a twofold purpose. 1, to guide implementation back in your respective classrooms, and 2, to provide consistent implementation across the state. If this is your first time joining us for the series, please be sure to complete the pre-survey that is located on GeorgiaStandards.Org. We also encourage all of our participants to complete the session survey that will be emailed to you following today's live session. Thank you again for joining us today. We look forward to continuing the conversation on Twitter. Don't forget to use #CultureOfWriting and handle @Godot ELA, and stay tuned for next month's session on digital literacy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.